Welcome back to the Global Realignment Podcast, where we'll be discussing national security and geopolitical issues of the day. I want to thank you for joining us for another show. It's been a little while. A lot has been happening. Today, we're going to be discussing politics surrounding the détente between Russia and the U.S. that's been rapidly unfolding over the past couple of weeks. It's been happening. I'd say last week was Trump's phone call with President Putin. And there's been a meeting between the various representatives, high-level representatives of both countries in Riyadh. And so a lot's been happening, and we're going to get into a lot of that tonight. As you know, like we were just saying, President Trump last week had an important, what some in the media are calling a breakthrough or controversial phone call with Vladimir Putin, president of Russia. They discussed not only the special military operation, but many other issues. And we're going to get into some of those issues as well that they discussed. This is the first time that the two countries, that the U.S. and Russia, have had formal communication reestablished. I think it's been about 3.5 years. So, approximately as long as the special military operation has been taking place. I think maybe the year before it took place was probably our last formal talks that we had with the Russians. So after the talks between Trump and Putin, both nations have agreed to send senior reps to Riyadh for further discussions. Now, keep in mind, these aren't formal negotiations. These are just discussions. Likely the negotiating teams haven't been assembled yet. And so these are just sort of preliminary talks, laying the groundwork for future discussions and a potential summit between President Trump and President Putin of Russia. I want to say off the bat, like I just said, that they're just sort of initial talks. I don't think that these discussions are going to be as consequential as many are trying to paint it. And so, it's good that these discussions are happening. And, the media is going to be the media, and they're going to be painting it in a way that it probably really isn't, making more out of these discussions than they really should be. And we've seen that. A lot has happened since these discussions have happened earlier this week. And we'll be getting into that. The UK and Europe are definitely making a huge deal out of these initial discussions, right? I think that they're also, in a way, window dressing, right? It's great PR. It's one of the things that are notable so far in Trump's presidency. Opening back up negotiating channels, diplomatic channels between the U.S. and Russia. So definitely a great accomplishment so far, and we'll have to see where it goes. A lot of complexity, a lot of questions. There's a lot up in the air right now, and so we will see. Now, as mentioned earlier, Ukraine, Europe, and the UK, and obviously Trump's domestic adversaries are acting like extraordinarily insecure about Trump's discussion that he had with Putin, and then the discussions that happened earlier this week in Riyadh. And they're overblowing these talks, and they're trying to paint Trump as Neville Chamberlain and Putin's puppet. All the stuff that we heard in 2016, 2015. We'll be getting into that a little bit as well. Because if you remember back in 2015-16, Trump said a few nice things about Putin, and the entire media, Republicans, Democrats, they all were, complaining and saying that he was, a puppet of Putin, and the Russians are manipulating elections, led to Russiagate and all these other things. So they're using the same playbook right now, right? And just important to keep that in mind for sure, because it's going to help us to kind of understand how that as these talks continue, those kinds of attacks are going to become more intensified. The truth is that Europe the UK, Ukraine actually want to do the same thing that they're accusing Trump of doing. So, the idea is basically that, hey, and this has been, floating around the media over the past couple of days, and the idea that the administration is basically being accused by the media and by the UK and Europe, the European Union and Ukraine, that, hey, Trump wants to go over our heads with the Russians and make a deal without any input, and they want to force it onto Ukraine. And honestly, I would argue that that's actually, they're kind of projecting. They like to do that. They like that scenario to be done on Russia. They like the US, themselves, the EU, Ukraine. They want to be able to just basically dictate the peace terms or a ceasefire and impose it on Putin. And unfortunately, the realities on the battlefield wouldn't allow that, and other diplomatic factors as well. And so, interesting stuff. And this is just over, again, a phone call and then this Riyadh meeting that happened earlier this week on Tuesday. So this is the kind of blowback that we're already seeing, and formal negotiations haven't even started. Principles, haven't been formally set down or anything of the sort. So, so we're just going to go ahead and jump in. And this is this is an article from the Wall Street Journal, and it's just talking about how, this is some of the points that I want to make that were leading up to the talks earlier this week in Riyadh. So the article starts out: top U.S. officials arrived in Saudi Arabia for the most high-profile talks with Russia since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Again, this is before the talks happened 3 years ago. As the Trump administration's push for bilateral discussions with the Kremlin triggered unease in Kiev and among European leaders. And again, I'm going to kind of bring us back to last week. I believe it was Tuesday when Trump had his phone call with President Putin of Russia. And from what we know, we're just going to dig into a few points that Trump made on Truth Social regarding that phone call. The call went well. And I think that, honestly, as we go through this, and I've mentioned this in another video, Trump has got a way of discussing the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Or, one day he might say something inflammatory about the Russian side. The next day he might say something, inflammatory about the Ukrainian side. One day he might praise the Ukrainian side. So look for patterns, look for inconsistencies. It's important to keep all those things in mind, because it'll, help us to understand how, negotiations might play out if we pay attention to sort of these smaller things. But a lot of mixed messaging coming from Trump and his team, even when he was campaigning, right? And we'll get into a little bit of that later as well. So Trump, this is regarding the phone call that he had with Putin last week. He said, "We discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, AI, the power of the dollar, and various other subjects. First, as we both agreed, we want to stop the millions of deaths taking place in the war with Russia and Ukraine." And, that's not really saying too much. Putin certainly wants to, dying to stop. I think anybody can agree to that. But again, what are the terms of that? What's that going to look like? How's that going to unfold? We agreed to work together, Trump goes on, very closely, including visiting each other's nations. We've also agreed to take our respective team. We have also agreed to have our respective teams start negotiations immediately. And we begin by calling President Zelensky of Ukraine to inform him of the conversation, something which I will be doing right now. And so, contrary to what, how these events are playing out right now, which we're going to get into, it seems early on, right after this phone call with Putin, that Trump he wants to keep Zelensky in the loop. But the very idea of having a discussion with Putin creates a problem for Zelensky, right? Somehow, I guess he thinks that if, that to end the war, you just don't need the other side. Where, again, like I said earlier, I think it's the idea that the European Union, the UK, and Ukraine just want to say, hey, this is what you guys are just going to leave the territories that you've conquered, leave Crimea, and you're just going to go back. Those are the peace terms. And we're going to go into NATO. We're going to get, or maybe we won't go into NATO, but we'll get security guarantees or something like that. But it seems like Trump is forthcoming. I don't think he wants to cut him out, Zelensky, out of these talks, these preliminary talks. Trump goes on, I have asked Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Director of the CIA John Ratcliffe, National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, and Ambassador and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to lead the negotiations, which I feel strongly will be successful. And I think he's just talking about the Riyadh visit. I don't know that these guys are going to be the ones that are going to be in the formal, negotiations once they get started. Might be a completely different team with them with these guys kind of advising in advisory roles. So back to the Wall Street article. The Kremlin said the talks would be devoted primarily to restoring the entire complex of Russian-American relations, and could lead to a summit between Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. The State Department described the Tuesday talks as an opportunity to explore Russia's intentions on the conflict in Ukraine and other central issues, rather than to start a detailed negotiation over Kiev's future. So again, preliminary talks. And I'm really interested to see who Trump appoints, if he's going to keep this team of Rubio, Waltz, and Witkoff when the negotiations start, or if he's going to, appoint a completely different team of people to do it. I have my doubts that he would do that, but we'll see. I mean, if he did appoint a different team of negotiators, hopefully they've already started the process of, vetting people to do so. People that might have experience dealing, diplomatic experience in Russia or Eastern Europe, and legal experience as well. You'll need international people who are familiar with international law and on this negotiating team. So that would be time consuming in itself. Trump wants to get this stuff done quick. Hopefully, if he's not using these guys, hopefully he's assembling a decent team. And honestly, I think many of the issues, when the article says Tuesday talks are an opportunity to explore Russia's intentions, I think that most of their intentions are fairly obvious. If you listen at any length to speeches that Putin gives or various members of Russia's government over the past couple of years, I think their intentions are fairly clear, right? The demilitarization of Ukraine, again, full administrative control of the provinces Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, Crimea, ridding the western part or their government of the ideology from the 30s in Germany, Russian, So, generally, I think most of the intentions are already known. And likely the two most consequential will be the demand for the remainder of the oblasts up to their administrative borders, like I just said, and the demilitarization aspect. I think these are going to be some sticky issues for the Trump team to navigate, because one of the things that we keep hearing about, kind of hammered into our subconscious every day when we follow some of these stories, is the idea that Ukraine wants security guarantees. They've kind of moved down the ladder from NATO membership because they've, probably heard, someone like Pete Hegseth saying, hey, that's not on the table anymore. They've downgraded to just security guarantees. And what does that look like? Does that look like European troops? Does it look like defensive weaponry on Ukraine? What's left of Ukraine? What do these security guarantees mean? Or what does demilitarization mean specifically for the Russians? All those things are going to be hammered out. So I think I don't think it's going to be a short process, because I think there's going to be a lot of haggling over some of these words and what they mean. And then the idea that these oblasts that I just mentioned aren't all the way under Russian control right now. Zaporozhye city hasn't been taken yet. Pokrovsk hasn't been taken yet. Kramatorsk, Slovyansk. These are major cities, major industrial cities within the oblasts that haven't been taken yet. So the idea of, in any negotiation, giving them that, the remainder of those oblasts up to their administrative borders and removing the Ukrainian element from there, that's going to be a complication as well. So it's going to be interesting. It's going to be very interesting to follow how this unfolds. The article goes on, still the talks represent a significant change in U.S. policy toward Moscow, which has been aimed during the Biden administration at isolating Putin because of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Ukraine won't be represented at the Riyadh talks, which are to be held at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. But Ukrainian officials will have a seat at the table if formal negotiations to end the conflict are convened later. Makes perfect sense, especially when you consider that these talks weren't just about the conflict in Ukraine, right? As we mentioned earlier, when Trump had his conversation with Putin, they didn't just discuss Ukraine. There were many issues because, again, when you've broken off diplomatic relationships with a country, there are many things that you have to discuss before even approaching even an ongoing war. So, of course, Zelensky is pissed off, and he said on Monday before the meeting took place, he criticized the idea of initial talks without Ukraine, saying that such discussions won't yield results. And, like I said, he's upset. I think there's a law right now in Ukraine that doesn't even permit the Ukrainians to have any discussions or, let alone negotiations with Putin. I think that they've basically signed it into law where they can't even talk to Putin. So it kind of goes to show you how, psychotic, Zelensky has been acting. But he doesn't like the idea that, the country, the U.S. that's been sponsoring him, decided to have a discussion with the country that he's at war with without him sitting there, I guess. So, and I don't know why he would. I'm not sure if he's meaning when he says, initial talks without Ukraine. If he's got envoys that wanted to go there, which I don't think I've ever seen an envoy of his, participate in any kind of, I guess, diplomatic conversations related to Ukraine. It's usually him, basically, is what I'm saying, that's representing Ukraine. So I don't know why he thinks that these representatives from Russia and the U.S. that aren't presidents, that, with them meeting up, why he would have a part. And I don't know why he would think he'd specifically have a part in it, because, the ranks are a little bit are slightly different between the principals if he's participating as well. He's not an emissary. Anyways, the article goes on. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters that Lavrov and Yuri Ushakov, a foreign policy advisor to Putin, would be in Riyadh for the talks. So that's the other side of principals meeting. Trump administration's Ukraine envoy, Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, said at a security conference in Munich on Saturday that he didn't foresee a direct role for European nations in the talks. but the Ukraine would be at the negotiating table when the formal peace talks are held. Now, that statement has alarmed European officials who say that the outcome of the Ukraine war is a paramount concern for security on the continent. And I'm going to read a small snippet out of this book that I'm reading right now. It's about the conflict in Bosnia. It's a book written by Richard Holbrooke. And this segment that I'm going to read is kind of discussing why it was crucial for Europe to be involved in the negotiations between the U.S., the Bosnians, and Serbia at that time, or the former Yugoslavia at that time. Why it was crucial to have the European powers involved in those negotiations. And I'm reading it because I think that this is probably a good way of describing the way the Europeans are seeing their role in any forthcoming negotiations. Let's see here. And it's called the Atlantic Alliance. And again, I would look at the Atlantic Alliance and their position. This position is similar to the way the EU is and the UK are looking at their role right now. And this is, again, a book by Richard Holbrooke called To End a War. And he says, keeping the Atlantic Alliance, the main pillar of American foreign policy for over half a century, from coming apart over Bosnia is one of our greatest policy challenges. After a year as ambassador to Germany, I was especially committed to repairing the strains that Bosnia had caused. We needed to work in a partnership with the alliance on a larger number of other issues, the enlargement of NATO, unfortunate, a common policy toward the former Soviet Union, the Mideast and Iran, terrorism, human rights, the environment, and organized crime. But Bosnia had begun to adversely affect everything. I addressed this problem in a blunt personal note to Christopher on August 23rd. The contact group presents us with a constant conundrum. Contact group being the group of negotiators that the U.S. formed to start the talks between Bosnia and Yugoslavia. The contact group presents us with a constant conundrum. We can't live without it. We can't live with it. If we don't meet with them and tell them what we are doing, they complain publicly. Again, the Atlantic Alliance. If we tell them, they disagree and often leak and worse. And I think that this is, again, some of the consequences if the Europeans are left out of any future negotiations relative to the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. In the end, we must keep the contact group together, especially since we will need it later to endorse and legitimize any agreement. On August 20th, one member of the contact group told me in confidence that his government now believes that at least one member of the contact group is passing details of the contact group meetings directly to Belgrade. I think I misspoke earlier. The contact group, I'm assuming, is just the members of the Atlantic Alliance. Any temporary Euro annoyance with less information can be managed. It must be outweighed by our need for speed and security. But we must never forget that we will need all if there is ever a settlement. The EU for economic assistance, our NATO allies for the post-UN peacekeeping force, and the UN for legitimizing resolutions, the Islamic Conference for additional aid, and the Russians and Greeks for their influence, however limited, on Belgrade. And so I think that it's kind of a decent sketch about the mindset of probably how the Europeans and the UK are looking at this situation, and how Trump's team is probably already seeing how there might be a necessity, no matter how annoying it might be, to include all of the European Union in these negotiations. It could create a situation that extend the negotiations longer than Trump wants to, with so much input. But later on down the road, it seems likely that there will be a need for everyone's participation, whether that participation involves the rebuilding of Ukraine or any number of issues, like again, security guarantees, if that's even allowed. Right, if that's part of the negotiations, they're going to likely need to pony up and provide some kind of security assistance. Not doesn't have to be peacekeepers, but some form of security assistance to Ukraine will be needed. And it's likely going to be the EU that's going to need to provide that. So they all know this, I'm sure, but it is interesting to point out again. And also, there was an article in the British daily newspaper on Monday. Keir Starmer is already, again, before it was the French doing it, but now Keir Starmer is doing it, the Prime Minister of Britain. He's saying for the first time he was ready to put troops on the ground in Ukraine. And so, I mean, that's nothing really new. I don't think that's going to happen, but, it's just kind of some saber rattling from the European powers. A few points here. Defense Secretary Hegseth announced that the U.S. does not see a future NATO membership for Ukraine, which is interesting and controversial in and of itself, because it's the first time basically that's been explicitly said by a high-level representative, U.S. representative. Starmer also stressed the end of this war, when it comes, cannot merely become a temporary pause because before Putin attacks again. Again, it's been the narrative since the beginning of this, and that's that Putin is going to somehow take over Europe, even though those same Europeans are saying the Russians are weak, and they're millions of them are being killed on the front lines every day. They're worried that somehow this kind of army is going to just push all the way to France or something. Starmer further wrote in his op-ed, while European nations must step up in this moment, and we will, U.S. support will remain critical, and U.S. security guarantees is essential for a lasting peace, because only the U.S. can deter Putin from attacking again. U.S. didn't deter him the first time from attacking, but again, what are those security guarantees, right? What kind of security guarantees? And how do you reconcile that with Putin's demand for demilitarization? And I don't think that that's like a maximalist demand either, right? Especially when you consider the history of this war, going back to 2014. Demilitarization may not necessarily mean that they're completely without military hardware, but we'll see what the definition of that is for the Russian side, and we'll see what security guarantees on our side means when everything starts. But honestly, the UK and the French and these European countries just don't have that much leverage. They have a role to play. I think that there are crucial roles that they'd have to play in any negotiations, but to be making some of these, saber rattling, chest thumping claims and, blowing out all this hot air, it's like you might be affected more by anything that Russia does over there, but we're the ones basically propping Ukraine up. And so Trump might be welcome Europeans' willingness to send peacekeeping forces in the wake of a potential. And I think that's the thing you have to understand, is that my personal sense is that I don't think that Trump is opposed to the idea of sending peacekeepers over into Ukraine. And that's why I said a lot of this stuff is volatile and it's changing day by day. Hegseth says no U.S. troops. Vance, in an interview, I forgot where it might have been. I forgot where he did this interview, but he said just, I think last week, that's not off the table. U.S. troops wasn't off the table. His words. So like I said, there's a lot of volatility right now in many of these discussions. Then rounding off the journal article, Trump administration officials insist that European interests are being taken into account. They may not like some of the sequencing that is going on in these negotiations, Waltz said, but I have to push back on any notion that they aren't being consulted. They absolutely are. And I believe that, right? And like I said, the key word there is they may not like the sequencing, right? They may not like the way these things, the routine or the order that these things are taking. But again, this isn't singularly, these meetings that they're having in Riyadh they're not singularly about Ukraine, because it's on a larger scale, it's about reestablishing a diplomatic channel, a formal diplomatic channel between the Russians and the U.S. And Ukraine is a part of again all of this stuff, but there are larger things that are happening as well in order to make possible the start of negotiations. So I think that's a definitely important thing to keep in mind. Now, the meeting itself took place. It was Tuesday. It lasted 4 hours, and it's paved the way for a near future bilateral summit between Trump and Putin. And the issues they discussed was exploring closer restored relations and economic cooperation, which is a good thing. I mean, just recently, there's just a little brief from the New York Times. There's a person called Kirill Dmitriev, and he is the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund. And he's just talking about some losses over the course of the war that U.S. companies have incurred. There's a lot of money on the table to be had. And so I think it definitely is creating interest on the Trump side because of the money involved that could be earned by both countries or even Ukraine. A lot of money is just laying on the table, and because of intransigence, particularly on the Ukrainian side, to come to the table, just sitting there, right? A lot of people are dying. But this representative says, Dmitriev says, losses of U.S. companies by industry, total losses, one of the columns said, some being, I think, like it's the sum at the bottom was $324 billion for U.S. companies since the war started. Again, you could blame the Russian side, blame the U.S., the Ukrainian side, wherever you want to stand on it. But again, a lot of money on the table for U.S. companies. After Ukraine, this little piece goes on. After Ukraine suggested the possibility of natural resource deals with Trump as Treasury Secretary, Bessent pushed to have the country sign away half of its mineral wealth. Marco Rubio said on Tuesday that an end to the war would be the key that unlocks the door for potentially historic economic partnerships. The economic track allows diplomacy, allows communication, allows joint wins, joint successes. Dmitry went on to say that the U.S. oil companies had really benefited from the Russian oil sector, adding, "We believe at some point they will be coming back." The document that he brought into Tuesday's meeting with the United States showed that the industries with the greatest purported losses among American companies that left Russia were IT and media. That might be something that interests Trump's tech oligarchs that he's got in there with him now. At $123 billion, and consumer and healthcare at $94 billion. So kind of interesting, some of the benefits that could be reaped if this war can be put behind everybody. It's not just for Russia, it's not just for the U.S. companies, but for Ukraine as well. Western companies that left Russia have officially declared more than $100 billion in losses since the start of the war. So that's a better number, it seems, with many of their prized assets sold under onerous terms dictated by the Russian state. So it's just kind of like a synopsis right there of some of the economic losses that the U.S. has incurred since the start of the war. Anyways, going back to the meeting and the issues discussed. So we have restored relations, economic cooperation discussed, acceptable terms to U.S., Russia, and Ukraine, and Europe. You have to have acceptable terms between all the parties. a 3-stage plan of ceasefire, elections in Ukraine, and a final agreement, appointment of ambassadors to lead the efforts. And so that's kind of the gist of what was discussed in the meeting. So highly productive meeting, long, 4.5 hours. And this then gives way to a feud. We're not going to discuss too many more details of the meeting, but we're going to discuss the subsequent feud that broke out into the open between President Trump and President Zelensky because of this meeting. Trump at a presser at Mar-a-Lago reemphasized that he would, and this is after the meeting in Riyadh, he reemphasized his wish to see elections in Ukraine. And that's a provocative thing to say. They've been avoiding election. There's martial law going on per their constitution in Ukraine. And because of that, there can be no elections there. So Zelensky is basically on his 6th of, I think, 5-year presidency. And so he brought that up at a presser. And he said that he wants to see elections, I believe, before any negotiations take place. And that would likely bring in a new president. And that new president would probably be more receptive to the U.S. and potentially even Russia's demands. And they might end this new president could end martial law. And that could mean the collapse of the Ukrainian army, because a lot of these conscripts would probably leave the front lines. And so that's going to be that was a sticky point for Trump to bring up. And yeah, that's the way it started. And Zelensky fires back later on and he says, well, Trump is in a disinformation space, basically just saying, hey, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not informed. And I believe it was in that same presser that when he was talking about the elections in Ukraine, having the elections, I don't have the statements right in front of me, but I believe it was in that same presser where he was talking about Ukraine having elections, that he also said that Ukraine actually started the war, right? And again, highly provocative, right? And I have to agree with Trump. And it's not in terms of they invaded Russia. It's that they had 3 agreements on the table since 2014, Minsk 1 and 2, and then the Istanbul Accords that the UK blew up in 2022, shortly after the war started. So they had the opportunities on the table, and I'm sure that Trump is probably talking about the most recent one, the recent one at Istanbul in 2022. And so again, an open rift. Zelensky is calling Trump misinformed. He attacks Trump. Trump fires back and calls him a dictator and says the war should have never started, the usual things. Calls him basically a mediocre comedian and all of these, So a lot of drama, right? I'm not going to say that these things are necessarily consequential in the long run, but definitely some things said that many people have felt who have actually been paying attention to these things even before the war started in Ukraine. So again, the bigger point to all this is that there's very little foreshadowing, in my estimation, that's coming out of this conflict between Trump and Zelensky, right? It's just too early to really draw many conclusions from what's being said. I mean, a lot of people are immediately probably wanting to run to the conclusion that, well, Trump's calling him a dictator. He's blaming Ukraine for starting the war. He's going to give Putin everything he wants. I strongly doubt it because of contradictory statements and, like I've said earlier, inflammatory statements that Trump has made over the course of the past couple of years about this war and about Russia specifically. So he's said insulting things, maybe not that insulting, like dictator and all these other things, about the Russians, right? He said these things, that he's made inflammatory and insulting statements to both sides. And really, as I said earlier, I'm paying more attention to how this is developing on the domestic side, the domestic front, the reception that, the media and Republicans and, the parties are having to this open feud that's happening right now. Because when doing so, we get a better picture of how any move Trump makes that appears to benefit Russia will advance in the will be received in the future, right? And that's what I'm wanting to pay attention to. There is a component of Trump's base that agrees with this kind of rhetoric, believes that, yeah, Ukraine had an opportunity, they didn't take it. This is what it is at this point, but we just can't keep funding it, right? And then it's on Trump's base. It's libertarians. Some Democrats feel this way, and they just want to see the thing end. They may have no opinion about either side. They just want to see it end, which is sensible. And there's everybody else, right? They want to see the continuation of Slavic bodies just piling up indefinitely to somehow, I guess, that advancing the cause of democracy. Now, obviously, it's that side that concerns me, because they were the same people, okay, that created the myth of Trump being Russia's or Putin's puppet and Russiagate and all these other things. And I really think that, there has been some noise made by Republicans over Trump's statements, right? And the media, of course, are attacking him. And this kind of thing is, we're starting to see this kind of thing happening again, where he's a puppet for Putin. He's this, he's that for Russia. He's selling out Ukraine. He's weak, and all of these other things, right? They did the same thing in 15 and 16, right? They attacked him. They called him a puppet. They called him, all these different, it was horrible, right? And I think that kind of criticism, being called a puppet, being called controlled, having half the country believe that you're not legitimate and that you didn't legitimately earn your first term, but that you were installed by the Russians. I think that stuff got to Trump in his first term, which is why he went from sort of an open-minded approach about Russia at the beginning in 15 and 16. But when he got in and went through all of the things he went through, it seems like he hardened up a little bit. Putin and Trump had sort of cordial relations with each other, but many of the actions that Trump took towards Russia in his first term were pretty inflammatory, in my opinion, right? He was the one that started to provide lethal aid to Ukraine. Okay. He was the one that pulled out of the INF Treaty. Okay. So it wasn't all roses. And I guess my concern is that if this kind of criticism starts again, right? And, he's a puppet and all these other things. If this starts again, is he going to be able to go into any negotiation? Is his team going to be able to go into any negotiation with a clear mind, with priorities clear, not, setting aside pride, setting aside egos and all this stuff? Are they going to be able to approach these negotiations in a way that's clear-minded and intentional, right? Or are they going to be trying to make a point? Are they going to be trying to make a point that, hey, we're not controlled by the Russians. We're going to take the hardest line against the Russians. Are they going to take that position, or are they going to, again, be open-minded? And are they going to look to solve the issues? Are they going to look to listen to the Russian side and actually try to understand and work around some of their differences? So I would just hope that these criticisms don't create a situation where Trump is trying to prove himself not a puppet of Putin by taking the hardest line against the Russians. So, so that's basically the gist of it. We had the discussion between Trump and Putin. We had the meeting in Riyadh, and then you have this public feud break out between Zelensky and Trump, which is hilarious. But again, the media is revving things up right now. And again, the narrative is, hey, he's a Putin puppet. He's a Russian. He's controlled by Russia. right? And in his base, there are a bunch of Russian bots and Russophiles and all of these other things. And it's, you know, watch the narrative open up though. And also, one of the last things I'll point out is watch for a false flag. And what do I mean by false flag? Something happening where people are dying and all this stuff, something happening, some kind of catastrophic event, right? Like a buka, and the media latching onto it and saying, and again, something happening in Ukraine that's catastrophic, it getting blamed on the Russians, and our media saying, Trump, you can't work with them. You can't give them anything because look at what they just did. They just initiated another buka. There won't be an investigation. There won't be any kind of open investigation or anything. And the Russians will get blamed. And the media is going to say, is Trump really wanting to work with this guy and, give him these concessions and all this stuff? How can he do that? I could see something like a scenario like that happening. It's just too easy today to see this kind of stuff unfold. But so we're going to see what happens. You're going to have to pay close attention. And I wanted to just close out by I found this article in Foreign Affairs. It's actually a longer article, but I want to take a portion out of it and read because it has a pretty decent admission of some points that I've felt since the war started. Many people who are better informed than I am that do shows on this stuff, they've talked about this before. It is interesting, and I'll just run through it really quickly. This is a portion of the article, and it's under the header, A New Security Architecture. And it says here, yet the core underlying causes remain. Russian opposition to Ukraine's reorientation toward the West, including NATO and the European Union at a time when Russia has been systematically, and this is the key, at a time when Russia has been systematically excluded from Europe's security architecture. As the Cold War structures have failed, both NATO and the European Union have expanded eastward, and Russia has been increasingly marginalized in the security discussions. Again, a cause for these are some of the underlying causes that brought us to where we are right now with this conflict, right? Many of these publications would have been reluctant a couple of years ago to say some of this stuff. But again, it is this key part here, the Russian opposition to Ukraine's reorientation toward the West, underlying cause, including NATO and the European Union at a time when Russia has been systematically excluded from Europe's security architecture, which they never should have been. As the Cold War structures have failed, both NATO and the European Union have expanded eastward, another problem, and Russia has been increasingly marginalized in security discussions. So the whole security infrastructure in Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia has to be recalibrated, and that's a monumental job. If Trump's able to do that kind of thing, kudos to him. If he's able to lead the effort in restructuring how Europe's security is managed, how it's if he's able to restructure the nature of Europe's security in a revolutionary way and reorient it away from these failed structures like NATO, that would be a huge accomplishment. Don't think it's going to happen. He's only got 4 years, but I'm just saying that'd be an interesting initiative if he chose. And I think that's kind of the direction that Putin wants to take. I think he's not looking at just ending the war, but rethinking the entire security infrastructure of Europe and Russia. Article goes on, a broader attempt to resolve the zero-sum nature of Europe's security structure would go further, trying to reorient the United States' approach to European security away from purely intra-NATO debates back towards arms control and U.S.-Russian dialogue. I mean, that would be great. Hopefully that's what Trump, again, has in mind. Not just ending the war, but this piece right here, trying to reorient the United States' approach to European security away from purely intra-NATO debates back towards arms control, general arms control, and U.S.-Russian dialogue. Most ambitious versions of such an effort are, for now, a pipe dream, according to them, because people at foreign affairs aren't they're Russophobes. But a successful push for conventional arms control, such as a successor to the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe, could offer a way to mitigate risk and fear in Eastern Europe and lower the likelihood of future conflict. Obviously, right? And so that's about all I have to say about this. It's been an interesting week, whirlwind events, nothing too consequential right now, I would say, but definitely much to pay attention to over the next couple of weeks and months. So we're going to sign off today. I want to thank you for joining us on Global Realignment, and we'll just see you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks, everybody.